The story of the White House is not a chapter in a history book. It is the living, breathing chronicle of the American experiment itself, a tale of audacious dreams, devastating setbacks, and ultimate glorious triumph, a story that belongs to us, the proud inheritors of this republic. It begins not with a building, but with an idea, an almost impossible yearning for a capital city worthy of the ideals for which we had spilled blood. The revolution was won, the Constitution was forged, but our government was still wandering, squatting temporarily in Philadelphia and New York, lacking a permanent, symbolic center. George Washington, the towering figure whose shadow falls over every line of this history, knew that we needed more than just a place to meet. We needed an eternal symbol, a crucible where the spirit of liberty could be housed and forever protected. It was an act of profound, visionary genius, this decision to carve our capital city out of the wilderness. A monumental, almost unbelievable effort led by Washington and the brilliant, meticulous city planner Pierre Charles L'Enfant. They envisioned a grand city, a Rome of the New World, and at its heart, positioned perfectly, lay the nexus of executive power, the President's House. The year was 1790, when the Residence Act, a piece of legislation born of complex political compromise, decreed that this magnificent new federal district, the District of Columbia, would host our permanent seat of government. Washington himself, with his military precision and agricultural background, chose the very site, a rise of land near the Potomac, commanding a view, majestic and humbling all at once. It was a perfect piece of earth, ready to bear the weight of history. But what would the house look like? It had to be grand, yes, but not imperial. It had to be strong, but not oppressive. It had to speak of dignity and permanence, not fleeting monarchy. In 1792, a competition was launched, an open invitation to the architectural minds of the young nation to design this central pillar of our democracy. The entries came in, some crude, some overly ornate, some utterly impractical. One, submitted anonymously, was signed with the cryptic phrase AZ and showed a magnificent, classical, almost Roman temple design. We would later learn this was the submission of Thomas Jefferson himself, showcasing his profound, yet sometimes overlooked, architectural genius. Yet it was the submission of James Hoban, an Irish immigrant architect from Charleston, South Carolina, that captured the attention of Washington. Hoban's design was not merely a building, it was a statement. It spoke the clean, clear language of neoclassicism, echoing the democratic architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, yet tempered with almost a Georgian sensibility. It was majestic without being arrogant, large enough for the nation's business, but scaled to feel like a home. It is often noted that Hoban's design bore a striking resemblance to Leinster House in Dublin, where the Irish Parliament met. But in Hoban's hands and under Washington's guiding gaze, the design was purified, made explicitly American, stripped of European decadence, and endowed with the clarity of our newly forged republic. Hoban, this humble immigrant, was awarded the commission, and the immense, back-breaking work began. This was not a quick venture. It was a foundational project, a decade-long endeavor undertaken by a dedicated mix of local laborers, free African-American artisans, and enslaved people, all working together to lift the stones of the Republic. The very walls of our house were being built from the local Aquia Creek sandstone quarried nearby, a physical testament to the fact that this institution was literally rising from the soil of our own democracy. The struggle was immense. Funding was perpetually tight, materials were scarce, and skilled stonemasons were hard to come by. We poured our collective effort, our raw national willpower, into this monumental task. The walls rose slowly, deliberately, each block of sandstone, weighing tons, hoisted into place as an affirmation of our commitment to endure. It was a construction site filled with dust and determination, a place where the foundational dreams of we the people were being mortared into permanence. Washington, though he would never live in the finished house, was intensely involved, riding out frequently from Philadelphia to inspect the progress, ensuring every dimension, every proportion was perfect, a commander ensuring his fortifications were unassailable. He saw it through, the foundation laid, the shell rising, the commitment sealed. Finally, in November of 1800, the house, still raw, still incomplete, but standing tall and resolute, was ready to receive its first resident. The move from Philadelphia was an arduous affair, marking the true, permanent establishment of our capital. Our second president, John Adams, and his formidable, brilliant wife, Abigail, were the first to cross the threshold. When Adams arrived, he found a house that was imposing on the outside, but starkly unfinished within. Plaster was still wet, fires were lit to dry the interior, and only a handful of rooms were truly habitable. Abigail famously complained that she had to hang laundry in the majestic East Room, the very hall that would later host the most magnificent diplomatic dinners and world-shaping press conferences. Imagine, the First Lady of the United States, amidst the echoing emptiness of the nascent palace of democracy, hanging clothes to dry. It is a powerful human image that grounds the legend in humble, recognizable reality. It was a cold, challenging, and historically important beginning. And it was in that very moment of arrival, chilled but resolute, that John Adams penned a prayer to his God, a profound hope for the future of the house and the nation, which he sent to Abigail. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. That blessing became a part of the house's bedrock, a standard against which every subsequent occupant would be measured. When Thomas Jefferson succeeded Adams, the house was already changing, reflecting the dynamic nature of our government. Jefferson, the great apostle of democracy and the master architect, immediately set about making the president's house more functional and, in his view, more purely American. He hated the idea of a palace and worked diligently to demystify the presidency. He introduced the first domestic improvements, adding low-lying classical colonnades on the east and west sides, the genesis of the future West Wing and East Wing, to connect the house to essential storage and service areas. He planted the grounds, transforming the surrounding area from a muddy construction site into a dignified landscape. But perhaps the most enduring part of Jefferson's residency was the creation of the public reception culture. He opened the house to the public, famously receiving foreign dignitaries in slippers and casual attire, symbolizing that the government belonged to the people, not the ruling class. This was the first great act of democratization of physical space. The president's house belonged to us. Then came the storm. For the first 14 years, the House, officially simply known as the President's House or the Executive Mansion, stood as a symbol of our fragile independence. But in 1814, that fragility was tested in the crucible of fire. The War of 1812, our second war of independence, brought the British military, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, right to our nascent capital. The government scattered in panic, the Capitol building was already burning, and the president's house seemed doomed. But the story of the fire is, above all, the story of courage, embodied by the indomitable First Lady Dolley Madison. As President James Madison was away with the troops, Dolley, with the sound of enemy cannons growing louder, refused to flee until the most precious treasures of our young nation were secured. Her focus was laser-sharp. The cabinet papers, the foundational documents of our government, and, most famously, the massive, full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. While others grabbed jewels and personal belongings, Dolley, understanding the power of national symbols, directed the servants to break the frame and secure the painting, saving the very image of our founding father from the flames.
It was an act of profound patriotism, a desperate measure to preserve the visual identity of our republic.
The British soldiers marched into Washington, a spectacle of terrifying foreign power, and set fire to the president's house. The flames, stoked by the determination of the invaders, devoured the interior. The grand structure, the shining hope of the American experiment, was reduced to a blackened, smoking ruin, a hollow shell. When the fire subsided, the house stood roofless, windowless, the once proud sandstone walls scorched black and cracked by the inferno. It was a physical representation of our lowest point, a moment when the very idea of the Republic seemed poised to collapse into ash. But this is the glory of the American story. We do not break, we rebuild. The task of Reconstruction fell initially to Hoban once again, but the political will was even more powerful. There were suggestions to move the capital elsewhere, to abandon the District of Columbia as too vulnerable. We rejected that counsel of despair. We would rebuild, stronger and more determined than ever. The fire was an insult, a tragedy, but it became a catalyst for defiant renewal. Hoban worked tirelessly to rebuild the walls, which had endured the heat and the elements, but the beautiful Aquia Creek sandstone was indelibly blackened, scarred by the inferno. To cover the extensive damage, to restore the dignity and brilliance of the structure, the exterior walls were painted with a mixture of lime, rice glue, casein, and lead, a brilliant protective whitewash. It was a practical solution to a profound problem, but it became a visual, indelible transformation. Before the fire, people called it the President's House. But after the paint, that brilliant, defiant, restorative white, the common man, the farmer, the merchant, the soldier, the traveler began to call it the White House. It was a nickname born of necessity, forged in fire, and affirmed by the people. It was during the presidency of James Monroe in 1817 that the first coat of that iconic white paint was fully applied to the restored exterior. The house, rebuilt and resurrected, now stood as a visible metaphor for our national resilience. Monroe, a figure of the revolutionary generation, was instrumental in furnishing the house with elegant, American-made or European-designed furniture aimed at restoring the dignity of the office. He infused the rooms with a sense of classical refinement, ensuring that the White House could stand proudly beside any palace in Europe. Monroe brought a sense of formal grandeur back, but he never forgot that the house belonged to the people who had sacrificed for it. The nickname the White House began to proliferate in newspapers and common parlance, a powerful, simple title that stuck because it was accurate, proud, and easy to say. The subsequent decades saw the house evolve, absorbing the immense, often brutal changes our nation endured. Andrew Jackson, the rough-hewn populist, held raucous, open-house parties, infamously dubbed King Mob receptions, where ordinary citizens poured into the East Room, sometimes muddying the carpets and breaking furniture, all to shake the hand of their president. It was democracy in its purest, most chaotic form, confirming that this was a truly public house, regardless of the wear and tear. The mid-19th century brought the house its greatest sorrow and its most immense challenge, the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln walked those halls, his shoulders bowed by the weight of a fracturing nation. The White House was not just a residence, it was a military headquarters, a nerve center, a hospital, and a deeply personal dwelling of grief.
The East Room was turned into a barracks for Union soldiers at times. Lincoln conducted war councils in his bedroom. His son Willie died in the house, casting a pall of almost unbearable tragedy over the family quarters. The very walls seemed to soak up the despair of a nation tearing itself apart. Lincoln's presence, his solitary walks in the middle of the night, his agonizing decision-making infused the house with a depth of tragic historical memory unmatched by any other American structure. The Civil War era proved that the White House was not just about grand balls and foreign policy. It was the sacred keeper of the nation's conscience, a witness to the highest acts of moral courage and the deepest troughs of national pain. After the war, the White House began a long, difficult march into modernity. Presidents like Rutherford Hayes and Churchill Arthur grappled with a house that was, frankly, falling apart and wildly outdated. Imagine, in the age of steam and steel, the president's house still struggled with inconsistent plumbing and inefficient heating. Hayes oversaw the first significant installation of modern plumbing and, thrillingly, the installation of the very first telephone. Arthur, a man of refined tastes, found the interior furnishing so hopelessly Victorian and cluttered that he commissioned Louis Comfort Tiffany to redecorate, and even oversaw a massive auction of 24 wagon loads of old, discarded White House items. Every generation wrestled with the need for function versus the preservation of history. As the 20th century dawned, the White House faced a crisis of identity and functionality. It was still the president's house, but the American government had exploded in size and complexity. The president, burdened with the oversight of a global power, was still forced to conduct the massive business of the executive branch, signing laws, meeting cabinet secretaries, addressing the press, from his cramped, dark family quarters on the second floor. The second floor was part bedroom, part office, part war room, and the entire structure felt suffocated by its own history and demands. Enter Teddy Roosevelt. TR was a force of nature, a dynamic embodiment of the new American century, and he would fundamentally change the structure and function of the White House forever. In 1901, TR made the nickname official, declaring by executive order that the executive mansion would henceforth be known officially and forever as the White House. It was a brilliant, simple, and powerful affirmation of the people's name for their house. But he did more than just rename it. He saved it. He hired the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White to execute a revolutionary transformation. TR's vision was clear: separate the president's professional life from his family life. The family needed privacy, and the presidency needed a proper, modern, dedicated office space. The solution was the creation of the West Wing. This involved tearing down the old, overgrown Western greenhouses and building a modest, single-story office building connected to the main residence by Jefferson's original extended colonnade. This was a masterstroke of architectural and functional genius. The executive office was born, freeing the president to conduct the massive business of government without his children playing hide-and-seek under the war room table. It was a clear, brilliant step forward into the modern presidency. But the White House was not done evolving. William Howard Taft, TR's successor, found the West Wing still inadequate for the growing needs of the administration. In 1909, Taft expanded the West Wing and, most importantly, introduced the single most enduring iconic architectural feature of the entire complex, the Oval Office. Taft disliked the rectangular shape of the previous executive office space and desired a more ceremonial, centralized room. The Oval Office, symbolic of the continuous and endless nature of the presidency, was a profound design choice, and it
The Truman era brought the final, desperate structural crisis. After nearly 150 years of relentless use, decades of poorly executed additions, fire damage, and the constant strain of a global power, the venerable White House was literally collapsing around the president. Floors sagged, beams were splintered, and the East Room chandelier swayed ominously. One day, Margaret Truman's piano leg fell right through the floorboards. Engineers were called in, and their report was horrifying. The house was structurally unsound, a fire hazard, and on the verge of total collapse. The suggestion was simple, but terrifying. Tear it down and build a new modern structure. We, the keepers of this history, could never accept that. The White House, our White House, was too important, too deeply rooted in the American soil and soul to be discarded. President Harry S. Truman, a man who respected history perhaps more than any occupant before him, oversaw the most radical, painstaking, and ultimately heroic renovation in the House's history. Between 1948 and 1952, the entire interior of the White House was meticulously gutted. Everything, every floor, every plaster wall, every internal partition was removed, leaving only the cherished, historical, fire-scarred outer stone wall standing. The house was essentially suspended in the air by massive steel beams, while an entirely new, modern, fireproof steel frame was built inside the historic shell. It was an act of profound conservation, ensuring that the White House of John Adams and Abraham Lincoln, the visible symbol of our republic, would stand forever, while being internally capable of serving the needs of the 21st century presidency. The Truman Reconstruction was a monumental testament to our commitment to preserving the physical heritage of our democracy, a powerful statement that our history is worth fighting for, down to the last piece of original plaster, which was painstakingly cataloged and stored. The final, glorious layer of preservation came with Jacqueline Kennedy in the early 1960s. After the functional, structural repairs of Truman, Mrs. Kennedy brought back the soul of the house. She recognized that the White House was not merely a government residence, it was a museum of American history, a living document of our past. She led a revolutionary effort to acquire and restore authentic period pieces of American furniture and artwork, making the White House interiors a beautiful, accurate, and dignified representation of 2 centuries of our history. Her televised tour of the restored White House, broadcast across the nation, connected we the people directly to our home in a way that no one had done before. It transformed the White House from a mere home into a permanent national shrine, a sacred repository of our collective memory. Since the Kennedys, the White House has served as the stage for the defining moments of the modern era. We have seen Lyndon Johnson sign the Civil Rights Act on tables within those walls, Richard Nixon bid his tearful farewells, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev negotiate the end of the Cold War, and presidents of every stripe grapple with challenges from terrorism to economic crises. Each era has brought small changes, new technology, subtle redecorations, security enhancements, but the core structure, the enduring vision of Hoban and Washington, remains resolutely the same. The House has absorbed the shock of assassins' bullets, the roar of massive protests, the celebration of major legislative victories, and the quiet despair of national tragedies. And that is the story, the triumphant, continuous narrative of our White House. It is a house established by the vision of Washington, named by the voice of the people after a devastating fire, saved from collapse by the determination of Truman, and restored to its spiritual glory by Jacqueline Kennedy. It is a structure built on the belief that we could govern ourselves, and it stands today, more than 2 centuries later, not just as the residence of a powerful person, but as the enduring physical symbol of the endurance, the resilience, and the glorious ongoing experiment of the American Republic. When you look at its shining white facade, know that you are not seeing a palace, but the home of we the people, a perpetual beacon of hope and democracy. Its history is our history, and its future is the future of our proud, defiant nation. It is and will forever remain the sacred dwelling of the American dream. This narrative, tracing the foundational vision, the drama of the fire, the practical genius of its reestablishment, the monumental structural salvation, and the ultimate transformation into a national museum, embodies the complete and dramatic story of the White House, all wrapped in the glorious, proud embrace of a true American storyteller.